Hello and welcome to Critical Moves. Two giants strengthen their links, a relationship which goes back decades and which cannot be broken in spite of the obstacles and an ideological campaign from the West. The relationship between Russia and Africa is what we're talking about today. So the summit between Russia and Africa has just finished in Sochi. It's brought together most of the 54 countries of the African continent with the co-presidency of Vladimir Putin and President al-Sisi of Egypt. So what are the conclusions at the end of this summit? The first Russia-Africa summit has concluded, and we can say this opened a new page in the relations between Russia and Africa. At the suggestion of our African friends, we have created a new mechanism for dialogue, and we will celebrate high-level meetings in Russia every 3 years. I would like to say that we think of Russia as a trustworthy partner of the African continent. We hope that Russia will work in all areas in Africa, including in infrastructure, energy, the building of roads, and many other areas in Africa. I would like to thank the government of Russia for being always alongside Ethiopia in defending its independence. We recognize Russia as a clear partner in our development, and Ethiopia wants to develop further this cooperation. Our relationship goes back many years. It was forged in struggle, and a free South Africa is in part a result of the support we had from the people of Russia. So let's locate these two giants on the map. Russia and Africa, an emergent. Russia is a Euro-Asian country throughout borders with Western Europe and Central Asia. It's occupies a ninth part of the planet and has huge energy resources, forest resources, and fresh water resources. Its economy is one of the fastest growing in the world. It has the third largest military budget, and it's one of 5 countries with recognized nuclear weapons. It's a member of the UN Security Council, the World Trade Organization, the G20. Africa is a continent of great inequalities. It's the third largest continent in the world, between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Its closest point with Europe is the Strait of Gibraltar, and it's linked to Asia via the Suez Canal, and it's just over 20% of the land mass of the planet. Its total population is 1,320,000,000, 43 inhabitants per kilometer. It has huge mineral resources: gold, diamonds, bauxite, manganese, nickel, cobalt, radio, lithium, titanium, and phosphates. It also has important oil reserves and gas reserves, huge water resources, and timber resources. It's a member of the African Union, the Arab League, the WTO, the IMF, OPEC. So let's go into some detail about this meeting which has just finished.
The first Russia-Africa summit was announced in August by President Vladimir Putin, along with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Happened on the 23rd to 25th of October, with most of the African countries, 40 represented by high-level delegations, as well as the leaderships of the main multilateral organizations, on the basis of principles of equality and mutual respect and friendship. That was the basis of the meeting. Its objectives was to bring solutions to local crises, the struggle against terrorism and extremism, cross-border crime, drug trafficking, and other urgent security issues, the strengthening of Russian-African cooperation was focused on education, health, security, the economy, culture, and science. The Economic Forum opened the summit. The aim was to increase the GDP of African states. More than 500 agreements exist in this sense, and these summits will be held every 3 years. So let's look at some of the press coverage. If we look at Sputnik, which Russia opens a way in Africa, Russia has opened up the road to business in Africa. The spokesperson of the Kremlin said, according to him, condoning debts in Africa favors economic and trade relations with the African countries. Our companies can work with mutual benefit together. The answer: this is not a new position on debt. It was taken some time ago. In 1996, the World Bank and the IMF launched a program to reduce the debt of African countries, and Russia joined the initiative in 2006 and condoned many of its debts from Africa. Russia condoned more than $20 billion in debt. Sputnik was one of the media sponsors of this summit. So let's look at another cable from Sputnik, which talks about new cloud technologies. The New Cloud Technologies company provides cloud technology to Burundi and has business in other countries of the African continent. We have made our first delivery to Burundi, creating a dedicated cloud for the country. This is a highly secure and well-protected cloud service which provides services which allows people to share documents and other, allow people to share these documents through the cloud and to manage their data. There's also in Por Africa on the 21st. Russia is still a long way behind its rivals in Africa in spite of the growth of its relations, but nor is that Russia's objective. The return of Moscow to the African continent has a military aspect,
where so far it hasn't exported much of its military capacity. All this points towards a double strategy of increasing the presence of private military companies in Africa. Russia wants to make up on lost time, and it wants to be in Africa to stay. Okay, we'll go to a pause now. Remember, you can always express your opinion. And how? Here's our question on Twitter. Why are Western communication companies lashing out against Russia and Africa? Are they whose shoe are they a stone in? With that, we go to the pause. So, what is the state of economic relations between Russia and Africa? How far back do they go? And how have they developed in the last decade? Let's take a look. Through much of the 20th century, the former Soviet Union had a strategic support for African countries who struggled for their liberation from colonialism. Specialists and scientists contributed to the construction of infrastructure, hydroelectric plants, roads. Soviet universities trained many African students. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then with the arrival of Vladimir Putin, they have signed many military agreements in the last decade. Trade has increased to $20 billion, whereas it wasn't $6 billion before. It's also reduced the debt of the African countries to Russia. There's a process of dialogue and talks. More than 500,000 soldiers from Africa have been trained at Russian facilities. There's nuclear cooperation in 16 countries in Africa, and a loan of $26 million to build a nuclear plant. It's also collaborated in fighting Ebola, the Ebola virus. In terms of natural resources, various Russian companies are involved in mining in the African continent. So let's go into analysis. So Ernesto Carmona joins us from Mexico and from Spain, Gil Vicente. Firstly, with Iñaki. So you're a little bit closer to Sochi than we are, Iñaki. Is this a big boost to these relations between Russia and Africa and the relations which existed before between Africa and... Yes, it is a big boost, which is particularly in a situation where the United States is paying little attention to Africa, although France is paying a lot of attention, and China is as well. 14 of the African currencies are linked to France. But of course, Russia's economic relations with Africa come from way back in the Soviet Union time. The Soviet Union needed bauxite for its industrial and military needs. The USSR needed these minerals. Another fact which is significant is all the cultural aid and educational relationship during the time of the Soviet Union, which allowed counterbalance the US policy towards the African continent. The most important of that, in 2009, the Prime Minister of Russia recognized that Russia had committed a mistake abandoning Africa, and it should return to rebuild its relations with Africa. Since then, there's been an intensive return to Africa by Russia. In 2015, economic relations increased by 180%. In 2013, Russia signed a pact with South Africa, a strategic agreement, on a question that would be decisive, the question of nuclear energy, which was then the only country in Africa that had nuclear energy. Developed by Russia, and there are various projects to develop other nuclear programs in the continent. The importance of the military industry, which explain this is something that China hasn't done, although China's presence in Africa is, of course, very important as well. Thank you, Iñaki. So that's a panorama of the restoration of relations between Russia and Africa with reference to specific aspects of this alliance. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But now with Ernesto Carmona, how do the imperialist powers, the United States, see this relationship which is growing stronger between Russia and Africa? Thank you. I think the United States must be somewhat worried about this expansion of Russian relations with Africa, because Russia is playing a much more active part in geopolitics now. Russia has gained a lot of prestige from its role in bringing peace to Syria. When the Soviet Union existed, it did have an important role in Africa, and now Russia is returning to that. It's important that Russia is ready to play this international role again. On the other hand, I think Russia is is now seeking to expand its economic capability. And the other thing, there is a vacuum being left by the United States, which opens up this space. And I think the United States is being taken by surprise. Its allies, like the United Kingdom and France, of course, have many interests in Africa and have had a lot of influence in the African continent. But the relative withdrawal of the United States is leaving a space that's being filled up by China and Russia, and to some extent by the Europeans. Now, we have two very important players who are advancing in a very strategic sense, which are particularly China and Russia. The United States has a much more isolationist policy now, although, of course, it continues to intervene in many places. And when it does intervene, it tends to be in a very disordered and often disastrous way. And this allows China and Russia to have more influence. And this upsets the power relations of the hegemonic powers. And something similar, of course, is happening in Latin America and other parts of the world, where countries no longer depend so much on the conditions which the United States wants to impose on those countries.
Ernesto, manténgase también usted con nosotros. Iñaki, voy a regresar a usted para reflexionar.
Let's go back to you, Iñaki.
Mencionaba Ernesto, usted también al principio de su disertación lo decía.
To take up something that Ernesto mentioned, this colonial past, which has left countries like Great Britain and France with que se desarrolló en Sochi recién entre Rusia y el continente. And they have been also watching closely this summit. How do they see this growing relationship between these two huge areas, Russia and a continent that has such huge resources, especially mineral resources, water reserves? How do the Europeans, the former colonial centers, see this new relationship? Well, we have a very simple example, which is the long list of politicians and scientists and technicians, administrators, military technicians, digamos, de intelectualidad preparada, de administradores de empresas, de administradores de estructuras políticas que en África se formaron en las diversas universidades, from Africa de la URSS. Were trained in Soviet universities. They didn't stop training when the USSR collapsed. They then continued to receive training in Russia. At the Lumumba University and other international universities, which are recognized for their quality. That was a very correct decision by the Russian government to continue with that kind of training. And the hundreds of technicians who received their technical training, but also some political training in Russia and earlier in the Soviet Union. This is giving way, opening the way now to all sorts of development possibilities. These technicians are received with open arms in Russia. And of course, the crimes committed by the Europeans in Africa is also a factor in favor of Russia. And one consequence of this, Russia has three main interests in Africa. One is when the United States tried to punish Russia for the question of Ukraine and the Donbass. Many African countries took a position in favor of Russia. That was a diplomatic victory for Russia. So that's one. So that international diplomatic support is one thing that Russia is seeking. They're also seeking energy resources, which Russia also already has itself, of course, but which will allow an intensification of agricultural production. So it's more expensive to obtain those resources in Russia because of the climate than in Africa. And China is also doing the same. So to help with the trade in those resources, and that allows Russia to conserve some of its own domestic energy reserves. And the third question is the military industry is not like the Western military industry, and it's certainly better than the Chinese, because it's an industry based on a wise policy developed by the Soviet Union since the 1930s, which are cheap, reliable weapons which survive in the worst conditions and are relatively easy to use by people who haven't had a sophisticated technical education. And this has a relationship between quality and price which is far greater than Western arms suppliers. There are many examples, both light weapons and heavy weapons. Nonetheless, this allows a scientific, technical, educational relationship to maintain this equipment at medium levels, whereas Western arms can only be used by very specialized minorities of the armies. The Russian weapons can be used much more widely, and that multiplies the economic benefits for Russia. So Russia has a clear advantage over the West, and also over China. Thank you very much to both of you. So we go to another break, and after that, let's get more into the geopolitical aspect of this new relationship, the relationship between Russia and in this recent summit with Africa. Another giant, a giant in terms of resources. And we'll have our guest here in the studio to talk more about this on the geopolitical aspect of this relationship. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Critical Moves. So let's look at the restructuring of world politics with new poles of interest. And that's the case of the integration of Russia with Africa. The main world actors who defy the unipolar world of the United States, China and Russia, are two of these states who are banking on equal relations and not neo-colonial relations. There are many. Both have had a big growth in relations with Africa. Russia has announced, considers the African continent as a strategic partner in the confirmation of a new world order. On the 30th of May this year, there was a free trade agreement. The African Free Trade Agreement came into being. Imperialism views this Russian influence with some wariness in the African continent. John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, Russia is developing its economic and political relations. However, in Somalia, where the US has had disastrous interventions, or in Libya, so that's our starting point for this next analysis with our guest, Julian. So we're looking at this growing relationship between Russia and Africa. I think there are a series of situations which have both historical and political implications. Russia is the inheritor of the Soviet Union. Its presence in Africa has been notable. The Soviet Union had big infrastructure projects in Africa, built armies in Africa. We were listening at the beginning of the program to one of the declarations, one of the African participants, who referred to that. Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who said he thanked Russia for always being by Ethiopia's side in defending its independence, as a key partner and one that they want to develop more, this relationship. Well, the economies that are growing fast in the world are precisely in Asia and Africa. And the two countries that are growing more than 7% are Ethiopia and Rwanda. A situation that's also happening in the Ivory Coast, Tanzania, who are also growing very fast. In the next 10 years, This will be an expansion which will contribute to very considerable growth in Africa. But this is very unequal growth, isn't it? Because not all the 54 nations in Africa are advancing at the same rate. They are looking a lot at development in Southeast Asia, which Mohamed Mahathir of Malaysia put forward this idea. In Southeast Asia, there are all sorts of different political systems and religions, but they've attained an objective. And I think Africa is making a big effort to grow and develop. The African Union and the Arab League, have they contributed to this growth? Well, Africa at the moment, because those who led the African delegation was Al-Sisi, who's, I think there's a change underway in Africa. For example, there's no talk of deindustrialization, it's a talk of growth. They have challenges to overcome, which they can do with the help of allies like Russia and China, like the financial obstacle, the formation of capital, increasing savings rates, not only for national growth rates, but also to stabilize border relations, because Africa, after the death of Mugabe, the leaders who led the decolonization process are passing away, which led to some degrowth. And the countries that are now contributing most to infrastructure are China, Russia, Iran. Europe's being left behind in this. If you look at the main Western media, they say that China and Russia are expanding around the world with a kind of new form of colonialism. So, I think there's a concrete issue here. African leaders are very highly educated, who understand economics. Anybody who thinks they can be fooled is badly mistaken. And politically, the idea of positive neutrality. So they're neutral in terms of the confrontation between the superpowers, but the Soviet Union was in solidarity with its proposals for decolonization. I mean, if you go back a lot further, Africa still has deep marks of colonialism, the recruitment of its peoples as soldiers in imperial armies, and the economic pillaging of the continent for the growth of Europe. And the way that the United States sees Latin America as its backyard, Europe sees Africa as its backyard. Russia's relationship is a complementary relationship with Africa. There's a very mistaken idea that the Russians are the inheritors of the Soviet Union and they only know how to make rockets, and they have a lot of experience in development. They have a lot of experience in developing infrastructure, shipping, and they're developing aviation, which is very trustworthy. In the 80s and 90s, you said a Russian plane crashed and there was a campaign of rubbishing the Soviet Union, say they couldn't build planes. But now Russia's aviation industry is much more advanced, and that can contribute to African development. There's a lot of, they're not just state enterprise, but Russian private companies taking part in Africa. So the question is how the companies with the control of the IMF and the World Bank, because often the problem in these countries is not the problem of resources, but of capital. And African countries are making important efforts towards currency union, tariff union, common tariffs. Cuba in the past, for example, forgave a lot of African debts. This is a mechanism which favors new investments, which relieves the budgets of the local countries and allows them to develop new businesses. The Silk Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, goes in the same direction. Includes programs to combat deforestation, desertification. Ethiopia went through a very difficult situation of war and famine, is now one of the fastest growing in the world. So what's the secret? I think the secret is to develop a layer of professionals, the wealth of each of these countries, the potential they have, the population. You can't continue to see the world in classic English economic theory. Countries with large populations have a lot of potential for development. This changes the concept, the way of looking at the world. Britain is going through a big political crisis with Brexit, for example. This is also, so while Europe is denying the possibility of Russia developing more trade with the European Union, it's looking for trade with other partners, and Africa is one of them. And this is a problem for Europe as well, of course. For example, the wave of migration across the Mediterranean towards Europe is because in the African countries where these people come from, either wars or there's very high levels of poverty. So by Russia and China helping to develop these countries, there would be less migration, at least you would expect. Without doubt, Africa has the potential for growth and is beginning to confront concrete problems of health, social development, which allows African citizens to believe in a solution at home and not by moving abroad. In Latin America, for example, when the process of integration have been sabotaged by the United States and Ukraine, but the African countries are moving away from the colonial powers. France continues to believe in its presence in Africa, but the presence of China and Russia creates new spaces in terms of development, which neither Europe nor the United States are offering. There's another issue which has been a factor of neo-colonization in Africa, which could be an obstacle to this kind of development. The presence of transnational companies. The transnationals represent interests, have a perspective of grinding down national states. They represent plutocratic elites which impose on the multilateral institutions a certain agenda, but Africa is resisting that because the leaders are clear about that kind of threat. Of course, Africa needs to make a big effort. Obviously, there will be obstacles and conflicts on the way. The question of the control of finances, the problem of who certify the materials for building a plane, the European Union and the United States. And this kind of thing cannot continue. Africa has shown that it has a huge population with a huge territory, with a lot of knowledge and wisdom, which can solve its own problems, and it's developing programs to articulate alternative forms of finance. Russia and China have helped in this direction. You mentioned one aspect, just to how does Latin America, of course, how does Latin America see this phenomenon? I think there are some important channels of relations between Latin America and Africa. Unfortunately, that hasn't been continued. Lula da Silva and President Chavez promoted that in a big way. In Margarita, in Venezuela, there was a meeting in that sense. But the sabotage directed at these popular governments by the right, that initiative has not continued. There's certainly a backsliding in that policy because of the interventions of the United States in Latin America. In Venezuela, we're in the same latitude as Ethiopia. So their experiences we can bring from Africa, and Africa can learn from us. But we can have complementary relations. Africa is a big producer of minerals, but they also need. Ethiopia today has an intercontinental airline which flies to Asia, which is a recognized quality airline. Kenya is growing in this sense too. South Africa already has an advanced level of development. Nigeria, with more than 100 million inhabitants, these are strong countries. The growing presence of Algeria. There are a series of countries who are growing, who are linking up with their neighbors. Senegal, for example, which has a very strong presence in West Africa. And all these are setting off a new dynamic. So the African continent should not be seen as the valiant poor. They are collaborators, our partners. The truth is, the exploitation and sabotage that began in Africa in the 19th century, when in 1885 in Germany they basically carved up Africa. Thank you very much, Julian, for your analysis. So let's go to some conclusions. The Africa-Russia summit, what brings together a continent pillaged by colonialism and then by transnationals. Can it now have a win-win relationship with Russia? So, what's been the point of the Western campaign to demonize Russia for expanding into Africa? That's why we close today.
Discover the cultural diversity that